Chinese President Xi Jinping meets with top European leaders to resolve trade differences as China and the European Union mark 50 years of diplomatic ties. Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar, filling in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. We begin with the high-level talks between China and the European Union. President Xi met with European Council President Antonio Costa and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen this week in Beijing. The leaders discussed a wide range of issues, including free and fair trade, climate action, and the importance of multilateralism. We begin with this report from CGTN's Yo Yang in Beijing.
During its meeting with the EU leaders, President Xi said China and the EU are both constructive forces for multilateralism and openness and cooperation, calling on both sides to provide more stability and certainty for the world. The Chinese leader also made major proposals on China-EU relations, and they include consolidating the partnership, adhering to openness and cooperation, properly handling differences, and of course, practicing multilateralism and upholding international laws. He said Beijing is willing to strengthen coordination and cooperation with Brussels in areas such as climate change and, of course, global green transition, artificial intelligence, and more. Well, on Thursday, European Council President Antonio Costa and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen held a joint press conference right here at the delegation of the EU to China in Beijing.
This EU-China summit takes place on the 50th anniversary of our diplomatic relations. This anniversary is an opportunity to reflect on our shared story and to look towards the future. The European Union remains committed to deepening our bilateral partnership, making concrete progress in addressing concerns with respect, goodwill, and honesty.
Meanwhile, China and the European Union have issued a joint statement on climate change. The statement highlights the importance of a just green transition, as well as cooperation under the Paris Agreement, and the two sides vowed to support the COP30 meeting in Brazil later this year and push for ambitious but fair outcomes.
Our joint statement on climate and the environment is a big step forward. We both see the opportunities to work closer together in sectors such as emission trading, just introduced here in China, carbon capture and storage, the circular economy, and our cooperation can set a global benchmark.
For their part, the European Union said since the establishment of diplomatic ties 50 years ago, Europe and China have carried out cooperation in a wide range of fields. They added that Brussels is committed to deepening the EU-China relations, constructively resolving differences, and promoting cooperation between the two sides on the basis of balance, equality, and mutual benefit. The bloc also noted that the EU does not seek to decouple from China, and that while in the face of a turbulent and uncertain world, they would work together with Beijing to adhere to multilateralism, uphold the UN Charter, and work together to address global challenges. Yo Yang, CGTN, Beijing.
Joining us now from Paris is Arancha Gonzalez. She's a former Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Affairs and Cooperation, and currently the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Arancha, welcome to the program. Ursula von der Leyen has described relationship with China at an inflection point and has called for rebalancing of bilateral relationship. She has also called the discussions in Beijing as constructive and very pragmatic. What is your assessment of the discussions in Beijing and this summit?
Well, I think what was lacking was trust. What was lacking on the Chinese trust is trust on the European Union. What was lacking on the European Union was trust on the Chinese leadership. And I think this meeting helped build a little bit more trust. Being very open, being very candid, being very clear on both sides, which I think is the beginning of building the trust that is needed to stabilize the situation and to stabilize a relationship that is very important for both of them, given that both are systemic actors in the economy, in climate change, in finance, globally.
So the fact they even met and had these discussions, is it by itself a measure of success?
Well, I think, success in a relationship is medium to long term, is whether or not both sides are ready to make sure this relationship delivers in the medium to long term. And as I said, there was a trust deficit. So I think it was positive from the point of view of being honest with each other, being clear about what each one of them expects from the other, and even making some inroads in areas where both see eye to eye, like, for example, the fight against climate change. So all in all, I think it was important that the meeting was held, and that was important in this medium to long-term desire to build trust between both.
And do you think Donald Trump's tariff threats, one day they're on, one day they're off, and his entire unpredictability, if you will that perhaps pose an opportunity for these two major economies to collaborate down the road, perhaps?
Well, it's very clear that today there is a huge pole of instability around the world that is centered on the United States. And that both the European Union and China, both being very large trading partners worldwide, are suffering the impact of this volatility originating in the US administration. But I do think that China and the European Union need to have a functional relationship regardless of where the US is or is not. This is because both are systemic economies, both are systemic countries, and both have today an interest in bringing stability to a very unstable world and bringing a little bit more rules-based to a world where others are more interested in power-based. So from this point of view, there is a convergence of interest, of course, between between China and the European Union.
CGTN Europe, our colleagues there, spoke with China's ambassador to Belgium, Soochow, and he was, for the most part, asked the same question I just asked you on whether U.S. trade tariffs pose a chance for Europe and China to collaborate. And this is what the ambassador had to say. Take a listen.
What we can do is we try to figure out what is at the stake and what we can do together. As one of the European leaders said, that probably, yes, the United States is very important, no doubt. It counts about 13 to 15% of the world's economy or trade. But we still have about 83 to 85% of trade that we have among ourselves. So what is important is for us to not to go astray, as others may, but try to focus on the right thing to do and try to see what we can do together to continue to promote multilateralism, to promote free trade within the WTO framework.
Arancha, how critical is the World Trade Organization at this juncture? And do you think its power has diminished somewhat? China has largely worked within the WTO framework, but the U.S. has adopted a more confrontational stance.
Well, I think the WTO is today a rules-based organization. It embodies the desire to have rules-based economic and trade relations rather than purely power-based. And it's true that although the US represents around 13% of international trade, countries that represent 87% of international trade have now an important responsibility of ensuring that the rules of international trade remain the norm. And if they do, if they are ready to play by the rules, then the US would be the exception, but the rest of the world would be rules-based. And from this point of view, what China does and what the EU do, given that both of them represent, each one of them represents another 13, 14% of international trade, will matter a lot. So if China and the European Union care about the World Trade Organization and a rules-based international trade, this is the moment to show it, walking the talk.
So how do they show that in terms of the WTO, that actions speak louder than words? Could you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I think right now, countries that care about the international trading system, the international rules-based trading architecture, need to make sure that they respect the rules of international trade, that they do not engage into tit for tat with each other, that they do not engage into trade protectionism, that they do not weaponize international trade. And if they do, they will be saving the World Trade Organization and its rules-based system. And if they don't, they would just be following basically the US, and this will pose a question to the existence of a rules-based international order.
Let me move on to the tariff threats on the EU. 30% US tariffs if the United States and the European Union do not strike a deal by August 1st. The EU has called these tariff threats completely and totally unacceptable and has vowed to respond. What is the likelihood of some kind of agreement by August 1st, and what would a European retaliation, Arancha, look like?
Well, I think it's preferable to strike deals. It's preferable to negotiate than to hit each other on the head. But faced with threats from the US administration, in my view, the European Union should not stand still. It should reply. It should respond. Again, preferring always to negotiate rather than to litigate. But if the US does not come to an agreement, I think there would be no other choice left to the European Union than to respond. And in order to do that, the European Union has already prepared, having the European Union member states adopt a list of retaliatory measures that would be put in place to the tune of over $90 billion US dollars to respond to the US should the US not come to an agreement. I mean, I think on this we have to be very lucid. It is a loser's game to impose tariff on each other, to impose tariffs and to counter-respond. It is a loser's game. It's preferable to negotiate. It's preferable to maintain markets open, given the huge interdependence of our economies, and understanding that tariffs would be like shooting each other on the foot. But if we come to that, in my view, the European Union should be very clear and respond.
And very quickly, do you think a deal between the two sides will be possible before that August 1st deadline?
Well, let's hope it is. Let's hope it is. Let's hope for the best, but also prepare for the worst.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to climate change. China and the EU clearly have big differences when it comes to trade, but they are united, at least it seems, when it comes to climate change and protecting our planet. How significant was their joint statement about climate change, the one that they issued at the summit in Beijing?
I think it is very important because climate change is today an existential threat. It's an existential threat to China and to the European Union, but it's an existential threat to humanity. And with this joint statement, both signal that they care about managing this existential threat, that both care about making the necessary reductions in their emissions, both care about helping those that don't have today the means to adapt to a changing climate. And I do think that with this, they are being responsible stakeholders. They are responding in a responsible manner to a threat that, again, knows no borders. So I do think it is important, and I do think that it matters that China and the European Union keep alive the spirits and the words of the Paris Climate Agreement, an agreement that was reached about 10 years ago. It's now the 10th anniversary, and that is an essential component to the fight against climate change. So important signal, and again, important that both Europe and China, and I do think that China is clear about that, are ambitious in their reduction of emissions to contribute to the Paris Climate Agreement.
So, Arancha, finally, where do you see this relationship going in the next 50 years? Of course, this summit coincided with the 50th anniversary of China-EU diplomatic ties. How critical is it for, as you said, for the two sides to build trust, to continue those discussions? And we keep hearing terms like the importance of managing their differences. Where do you see this relationship going, and what is the best way to manage those differences?
Yeah, I think when I look back, 50 years ago, I see a very clear commitment 50 years ago on both sides to collaborate, to cooperate, to work together to manage challenges that both are confronting, but also challenges that confront the wider international community. So what I hope is that 50 years on, in 50 years, this spirit of managing differences, working together in a cooperative manner will remain, because I am convinced that it's only through that collaboration, being lucid, being clear about where there are differences between the two, and there are obvious differences today, but being very clear about what these differences are, work to ballast the relationship, building trust, and contribute through that to a more stable international environment. I do hope that in 50 years we will be there too.
All right. Thank you so much, Arancha Gonzalez. For more on the China-EU summit, let's bring in our next guest. Joining us now is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor with Soochow University in Beijing. Victor, welcome to the program. Chinese President Xi Jinping really tried to put the emphasis on the need for China and the European Union to pursue cooperation, even when they don't always see eye to eye. In your view, how do these discussions go in Beijing?
Thank you very much for having me. I think it is very positive that the two EU leaders were in Beijing for the summit meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Secondly, they managed to come up with a joint declaration on climate change. This means that despite of all the differences between China and EU, if they can set their minds on achieving greater things, China and EU can actually manage their difference and do the right thing. Now, other than their agreement on the climate change, whether China and EU should have also agreed on many other things, I think so. However, they didn't achieve that, which is a pity in itself. I wish that China and EU should have emphasized their common desire of defending free trade, promoting free trade, and try to engage China with EU for the mutual benefit. But I hope maybe China and EU should meet again at the summit level very soon to really address these very important issues, because I think defending free trade is not only good for China and for the EU people, but it is also good for mankind as a whole.
One of the big issues for the EU is its trade deficit with China. Europeans say it has doubled in the last decade to $350 billion, Victor. And of course, the EU is concerned about China's industrial overcapacity. What are the Chinese saying about these allegations?
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, there is no overcapacity in China. We think the Chinese industrial production is very efficient And such efficiency is not only in China's benefit, but also in the benefit of all the other countries included. For example, in terms of the solar power, China is the biggest producer of the solar power. China has been using solar power for generation of power for itself. It's not overcapacity. I think mankind should do a much better job in installing and making use of solar power in order to really cut down on the impact of the climate change. And it applies to many other sectors. For example, in terms of the EV car, China is the biggest producer of EV cars. China is also the biggest exporter of EV cars. But this is done in China's firm conviction that all countries need to make that leap of faith from using fuel cars to using EV car, because the EV car technology represents the best technology for the future, and EV car can really contribute to cutting down on the impact of climate change. So I hope EU will have a better understanding of what China is, and also join China in using these new ways of production, achieving higher efficiency, rather than doing the small calculation and try to second guess China's great achievements in productivity and efficiency.
And I want to talk about climate change in a moment, but what was Beijing hoping to achieve, Victor, from these discussions? And did the two sides manage to at least narrow the differences just a bit in these high-stake discussions?
Well, I think the fact that the two EU leaders were in Beijing for the summit meeting is in itself a very positive thing. And the Chinese leader and the two EU leaders did talk about issues of their common interest. That's also very positive. Now, the two sides do have differences, of course. For example, EU seems to wear geopolitics on their lips, whereas China does not want to really engage with EU in terms of geopolitical rivalries. From the Chinese perspective, China and EU are not rivals or competitors or enemies, for example, or adversaries in any sense of the word. China looks at EU in a very objective and balanced way. We can focus our attention on economic development, helping both the Chinese people and the European people to achieve better living standards, rather than to tear each side down into pieces by focusing on geopolitical rivalry between China and EU. There should be no geopolitical rivalry at all from the Chinese perspective between China and EU. Therefore, I think China and EU really need to maximize their common ground while minimizing their differences, especially in terms of geopolitical perceptions in the world.
Well, you bring me to my next point. A lot of concerns about Donald Trump's on-again, off-again tariffs and its impact on international order, on the global economy. China and the United States, of course, have agreed on a trade framework. But before we talk about that, how much has this unpredictability by Donald Trump's tariffs, how much did that play into these discussions in Beijing between the Chinese and the European Union?
Well, it is a fact, and I hope this fact is both recognized by China and Europe as a whole, that the greatest certainty in the world of today is the uncertainty of the United States. And the greatest predictability in the world of today is the unpredictability of the Trump administration. Now, this is really not something positive for the United States. Being the largest military power in the world, and also the largest economy, if you're using official exchange rate as the benchmark, the United States has a lot of responsibilities on its shoulder and should be a source of reliability, predictability, and certainty rather than otherwise. And the fact that the United States has been very capricious and frivolous in dealing with matters of life or death for many countries in the world, and engaged in this global tariff war against the rest of the world and also focusing on China.
But Victor, does that
the United States to do.
Apologies for interrupting you, but does that unpredictability perhaps pose an opportunity for China and the European Union to work closer together?
I hope so, and I truly believe that this is something that should bring China and EU together. However, my concern is that the European leaders are very much distracted by other considerations, especially geopolitical rivalry or geopolitical considerations. And now that there is a war going on in Europe, I think it will be absolutely in Europe's interest to do whatever they can to end the war as quickly as possible, as President Trump has been doing, at least on the surface of it. And China has been calling for both Russia and Ukraine to stop the war from the day one when the war broke out. Therefore, I think there should be not that much of difference between China and EU as far as that war is concerned in Ukraine, but European leaders don't seem to have that level of wisdom to try to adopt a very philosophical position in dealing with the war in Ukraine.
What do you mean by that?
For an immediate end.
Victor, what do you mean by a philosophical position here?
The philosophical position is that hopefully there will be no war breaking out any part in Europe. And if a war breaks out, everyone needs to do our best to try to put an end to that war, rather than allowing that war to be extended again and again and prolonged again and again, because Europe and the rest of the world cannot afford to have a protracted war in Ukraine. It will be much better in Europeans' interest as well as in the interest of the people at large throughout the world to put an end to that war.
Victor, the United States, as you know, has also pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And again, when it comes to climate change, it's an area that the European Union and the Chinese really see eye to eye on. How significant was their joint declaration on climate change? And Brazil will host a UN climate change conference this November. What are your hopes for these discussions with the United States pretty much out?
I think China and EU can really see eye to eye on this great challenge for mankind. And in US absence, now that they are bailing out of this very important international framework, China and EU can decide to coordinate their action to do the right thing, not only for their own people, but also for the benefit of mankind as a whole. It is a shame that the United States is not involved in this joint effort in dealing with the climate change impact. I hope sooner or later, and no more in 3 more years, the United States will join again mankind's joint efforts in dealing with the climate change impact, because it will not be in the fundamental interest of the American people, and it will not be in the fundamental interest of mankind as a whole if the United States does not join mankind's initiative in dealing with the climate change impact together with all the other countries.
Victor, we're very short on time. EU and China are marking 50 years of diplomatic relations. How do you assess the relationship today, and what are your hopes for the next 50 years? And brief, please.
Thank you very much. I think China and EU should reach a conclusion that China and EU are not rivals or adversaries or enemies or even competitors against each other. China and EU can get along on equal basis, and we have no fundamental differences which will divide China and EU. So now that we are celebrating the 50th year of good relations between China and EU, we want to do whatever we can to make sure that China-EU relations will scale new heights. We'll make sure that China and EU will be stabilizing forces for peace and stability, and both China and EU should be champions defending free trade for their own benefit, but equally, if not more importantly, for the benefit of mankind.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington. Thank you for watching.